We've got a network of 10 offices across the country, and we provide a multitude of services, including professional services for engineered coastal structures and waterfront infrastructure projects in the marine environment. And so today, Justin's going to focus on the structural marine permitting services. He is our lead marine engineer and contract specialist. And a really interesting fact about Justin is that he is both an engineer and a lawyer. So he's able to apply both of those skill sets that can provide our clients with engineering and permitting support across the United States.
For permits in our organization, and I was doing marine engineering, and again was also an attorney, and CDI figured that those combination of skills would be good for permitting, and so they designated me, and 10 years later I'm still doing it, and today I'm going to talk to you about some things I've learned along the way. Level of detail we're going to go in here, it assumes you know kind of permits, maybe not all the specific requirements, but you do know about them, and you're familiar with marine or structural projects. And just a note, if you've ever been confused by permits, there's a good reason for that. It can be confusing at times, and a big reason for that is a lot of times it's a moving target. Things are constantly changing, what you need to submit, who you need to submit it to, what kind of analysis you need. So it can be confusing at times, and it's a continuous learning experience for everybody, certainly including me as well. So whenever I do a presentation, I like to give a brief roadmap of what I'm going to plan to talk about. Today, I'm going to go over the process of applying for permits as quickly as possible while giving them information. It can be a little dry at times, but it is important. Then I'm going to talk about some of the things I've learned and some tips and experiences over the 10 years I've been doing this. And then we'll try to save some time at the end for a question and answer session. On the right of the screen here, you see a marine picture. I'll just point this out. We do have these throughout. Sometimes they're there just to break up the text, and sometimes they're applicable to what I'm discussing, and so I'll probably point that out. So the permits we're going to cover today, and I'm going to focus on Louisiana permits in this presentation because you have to pick something to focus on, and that's probably the most we do, and that's where we're based. But the principles apply to permits everywhere, and the core permits are federal, so they are everywhere. So even though we're going to focus on Louisiana, it's really applicable to other states as well. And the permits we're going to cover are Levee District, the core permits, the Department of Natural Resources permits, and Louisiana DOTD permits. This is just a small section of the world of permits. There are many other types. Some, again, there's just a few, are environmental process related, DEQ, air quality, vapor recovery, local permits, railroad right-of-ways, if you'll be going over or under a railroad or in their right-of-way. And again, that's just several of many. It's a big picture. Why do you have to obtain permits? If you're doing work on your own private property, who is it to tell you what you can and can't do? And as you might expect, there are laws. And I'm not going to read through every one, but every permit you have to obtain has a law that provides for it and the agency that governs it. And most of them, at least on the federal level, the law is commonly associated with the name of the permit. So Section 10, 404, 408, 103, and then there's a couple of Louisiana revised statute and administrative codes that provide for Louisiana permits. So starting off with the Levee District, one thing to note is that it is not technically a permit, but it is just a letter of no objection, or LONO as it's commonly abbreviated. It's a bit of semantics, but it is what they refer to it as a letter of no objection and not a permit. On the right here, I've got a map of the Louisiana levee districts. There are many. You can get online and find an enlarged version of this to see exactly where you land, and you can always call them up to see if you're confused. So when is it required? That's any and all activity, including subsurface work on the Bachelor or within 1,500 feet of the Mississippi River center line, the Mississippi River levee center line. And this comes from the Pontchartrain Levee District guidelines, but it applies to all. And I'll point out, it used to be different, that it was any work within 300 feet or subsurface work within 1,500 feet, but now it is any work within 1,500 feet. So sometimes people might think they don't need one if they're not digging, but that is not the case. This distinction does still matter in reference to work being halted because of the river level at the Carrollton gauge, because that usually applies to subsurface work. But it is all work within 1,500 feet of the levee center line. The process, and I'm going to go through this process in the most detail, but it applies to most of them, so I'll go through the other ones quicker. I submit a cover letter and sketches to the levee district you're applying to, the Army Corps of Engineers Completed Works Operations Division, and the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. The Corps and the CPRA are going to be the real hurdles to overcome here in getting your permit. They review it on behalf of the levee district, issue their letters of no objection to the levee district, and then usually the levee district just signs off on it at that point. Occasionally they'll have a comment or two, but it's minor compared to CPRA and the Corps. The letter, I always include a project description and the scope of the project, and then they're going to want to see estimated start or end dates. Usually at this stage, you're not 100% set on what those are going to be, so a range is acceptable. And you can do it based on receipt of the permit if that's going to be controlling the timeline. So you could say project will start upon receipt of the permit and conclude approximately 6 months thereafter, or something along those lines. But they do want to see an estimated start and end date. And you can't just say something crazy like it'll take place over the next 5 years, and that's definitely not true. I always mention other permits or applications that have been applied for simultaneously. If not, they'll probably bring it up and ask you about it, which could result in some delays. A big one is whether equipment will need to cross the levee, and if so, whether that equipment will exceed HS 20 loading or 72,000 pounds. And this is important because if you are exceeding that load, you definitely need a stability analysis. If you're not, you may still need it based on other factors in the project scope, but it's not an automatic. So that's always something to consider within the project. I also like to request a waiver for work to be done above +11 at the Carrollton gauge in the application. It is easier to go ahead and do it up front. You know if you have it or if you don't, so you're not scrambling when the river level rises and you're trying to get a waiver at that point, when usually the Corps and levee district are very busy anyway. So it's easier to just do it up front, and that's something I recommend. Then I'll refer to the sketches that we have depicting the work. I'll state what size they're to be printed at and that they're scaled, because they like the sketches to be scaled. And finally, I'll conclude with any relevant contact information for not just myself, but any other parties that may need to be contacted in regard to the loan note request. So the sketches, to go in a little detail about what I include there, I always do these at 11 by 17, and I draw them to scale. And I'll start with the vicinity map, which kind of locates you within the world as to where the project is. An example here is on the right. It's a little squinch, but you can see it, and it'll have things like highways and river mile, and I always put the latitude and longitude on of the project. You're not really conveying much project information here, but just kind of locating where you are. Then from there, I'll go to the site plan, which zooms in some and kind of lays out more of the overall scope of the project. If it's a dock, it'll be kind of an overall look at the dock, or a shot within 1,500 feet of the levee if it's landside. And sometimes I'll include an aerial photo here as well, as opposed to just a CAD drawing. It kind of depends on what's going on and what will help, but usually it's CAD. From there, then you'll start to get into more of the details of the project with enlarged plans, sections and details of the work you're doing. And this does not have to be construction quality level of detail. It you do have to have a pretty good grasp on what you're doing and where it's going, and big things like size of piles. Yeah, it can change a little bit, but you can't just relay out a dock or anything along those lines. But on the other hand, they're not going to be concerned about seeing bolt patterns and details of connections and smaller things. So you don't have to wait till you have construction drawings, but you do want to have a decent idea of what you're planning on doing. If you're going to be doing work on the levee or very near it, you're going to need to include a levee cross-section, drawing a scale with the actual elevations of the levee, the theoretical design levee elevations, and the work you plan to do on it. So if you're going to be close, definitely go ahead and include that. And in general, you should show the distance of work from the levee center lines and to the nearest levee station. So once you've submitted all that, the Corps and CPRA will start to take a look at it, and they may respond with a request for a specific analysis or detail of something that they want to see. And some examples of those are survey by licensed surveyor, or settlement analysis, bearing analysis, stability analysis, or seepage analysis. And there's some strategy you may want to consider here. You can, if you're confident you're going to need these, go ahead and do it beforehand and include it with your application. Typically, we'll wait and see what's requested because you're never really sure outside of stability analysis sometimes. And if you're driven by time, you may want to include it ahead of time. The downside to including it up front is you may be obtaining these studies that you don't really need. So just something to consider there. But once CPRA and Corps have reviewed and issued their letter of no objection, then the levee district will compile and issue their letter of no objection. At this point, usually it's just a matter of housekeeping and secretarial matters. They very rarely ask for anything related to the project, but I have seen a time or two where they've asked for maintenance or upkeep requirements for things on the levee, but typically it's just a secretarial issue at that point. So restrictions involved with the levee district letters of no objections. Subsurface work is only permitted within 1,500 feet of the levee or in the river on the Batcher when the Carrollton River gauge is below plus 11 feet. You can, again, request a waiver up to plus 15, but that is not guaranteed, and it really depends project specific and location as to whether or not they will grant that. Timing, this one can vary a lot. I've seen 6 to 8 weeks for a spread footing 1,400 feet from the levee with minimal load. That's rare, and I've seen a year based on what's requested and delays with the river. A lot of them fall within that 4 to 6 month range, but it really depends on the project itself and what's being done and where it's being done. Moving on to the Corps permit. So first we'll talk about the Section 408 permit, and this is a more recent permitting requirement. The law's been on the books for a while, but back in about 2016, they started a new enforcement policy on it, and for a little while there, it was pretty confusing because even the Corps themselves wasn't exactly sure what had to be done to issue these permits. But fortunately, since then, it's been organized a lot better, and now it's not quite as much of a problem as it used to be. So when a 408 is required is for any alterations or actions that affect federal projects and navigable waterways. And federal projects, at least in this area, typically include flood control or coastal and that, like the levee. So just to compare it to the levee district, where this may not be required, the levee district would be work not within the levee or Batcher, but is within 1,500 feet of the levee on the land side. You'll need a levee district, but not a 408. And vice versa, you'll pretty much always need a levee district if you need a 408 in Louisiana. The application process is very similar to the levee district. It's you want to submit a cover letter, which is going to be pretty much the same, but you do need to include a couple extra things. You need to include an OMR R&R statement, which basically says that you'll maintain any installations that are included with the project, and then a statement of the real estate requirements that are involved with the project. You'll again include sketches, which are going to be the same as the levee district. And here are a couple of extra requirements. You'll need a statement of no objection from the non-federal sponsor, which in Louisiana, that's going to be the levee district. And for that, you're going to have to provide them with an overview of the project, and then they'll say, hey, we don't have any red flags on this, no immediate objections. So it's not the no objection that you're trying to get and with the permitting process. It's more of just a quick look, no immediate objections. And the levee districts are familiar with this requirement now, so they know what to do, but it is something required for 408. You need to submit a quality control letter, which states that the project has been designed to all the relevant codes and lists those codes and the calculation software used, and then a professional engineer needs to seal it that did that. And then for the Corps, there's an application form that you need to fill out. It's a page or two. It's pretty straightforward, but it does need to be included. Timing wise, and I'll say this several times throughout, you must submit this at the same time if possible with the regulatory Corps permits and levee district letter of no objection request. Really, it's best to go ahead and submit this all at the same time, unless you have a good reason not to. Otherwise, you'll probably just have delays waiting to get it all submitted. And timing going to be pretty similar to the levee district letter of no objection, just without that real short end, because usually the projects are more complicated when the 408's involved. The Corps regulatory permits. So a slightly different group within the Corps reviews these, the regulatory group, but still Corps permits. And these include Section 10, which is obstructions in navigable waterways, wetlands, or Section 404, and ocean dumping, or Section 103, which really comes up more with dredging. The application process for these permits is similar in that you're going to submit that same Corps permit form. You're going to submit, again, cover letter and sketches, which you really don't have to have the cover letter, but I like it because it summarizes things and it gives one reference for people who review it to look at. And the sketches here are going to be same in content, but I always submit them in an 8.5 by 11 format. That was traditionally required. I don't know if they're as strict about it as they used to be, but I'll still go ahead and do it. They used to require it for notice and filing in their system. So it doesn't take that much time to go ahead and change it to 8.5 by 11 format, but I think it's worthwhile to avoid any delays. If required, the Corps will then post notice of application for 30 days, and I'll send out the permit request to all the agencies, divisions that has review it inside, and some of those are the Coast Guard, or Mensa, which is a group that represents the river, like the river pilots and tugboat and interests. And so they'll all review it and get back to the Corps about any comments they have, and then they'll get with you on those if needed. And you get a response anytime after all the internal agencies review it. And typically it's going to be in that 3 to 6 month range. But if you're doing like a big site delineation for a new site for wetlands, it can take a good bit longer, especially if you use the Corps to do that. Exempt work, maintenance on existing permits, but I guess what qualifies maintenance can be debatable. The Department of Natural Resources Coastal Use Permit. This is again a Louisiana permit, and it is required for any state or local concern in the coastal zones, which on the right here, if you can see that red outline, anything inside of that, even up in the St. James and Livingston parishes are coastal zones, so the coast extends quite a bit inland. And it specifically lists industrial construction as a concern, so it's pretty broad. Fortunately, it also includes a broad exception or exemption, and that's all work that occurs on lands 5 feet or more above sea level and that do not have direct and significant impacts on coastal waters. It also includes work performed within previously developed areas and maintenance. And just a brief thought here, this is basically the state version of a 404 wetlands permit. So they're going to be looking at the same things here, and similar mitigation could be involved. But that's what the Department of Natural Resources is going to be concerned with here. The process, if you were within that coastal zone, they have a special joint application with the Corps of Regulatory. It's one form, you submit the same thing, so it's going to be basically the same thing, but with a little bit different form if you are within the coastal zone. And along those lines, the timing is going to be similar to the Corps of Regulatory permits. Louisiana Department of Transportation. It's going to be required for any work over or under public roads, and I'll note that this includes maintenance, and also any work parallel to public roads within the highway right-of-way. And this is for structural permits, right-of-way permits. The DOTD has other permits they issue as well. The process, again, I'd like to submit a cover letter, and you need the drawings of the structures and the proper form, which I have many. I have a screenshot on the right here of a pipe data sheet form, and that's going to be needed anytime you have pipe going over under a state highway. And you submit that to the district permit specialist, and sometimes it's good to touch base with them to make sure you get them all the information they want and are including the right forms with your application. And just a note here, especially on the maintenance, with new structures, DOT wants to see calculations, and that's been that way for a while, but now they're asking for even existing old structures that if you're changing out pipe or doing anything to it and requesting a permit, they're going to want to see sealed calculations in a letter stating that the pipe rack has been inspected and is in good condition, and the calculations to show that it's within code limits. So that's something to consider, even if you're just doing changing out a pipe or something you think is pretty simple. They've been wanting to see calculations if you haven't done that recently. So the district will review your application and make any comments or needs that they have. And then it's sent to DOTD headquarters for review, and they have a couple different groups of engineers that review it. And you also have to submit detour or lane closure plans if you're going to have that included as part of the work, whether it be detour or lane closure. So that's definitely something that's going to need to be included in the permit application. And these I found typically take 3 to 6 months, depending on how busy they are and how quick they get to review and respond for things they want to see. But that's about the range it usually falls in. Some just general application considerations. Almost all applications are done by email or online now. Some of them require it, don't even allow you to mail it in. Regardless, I would highly recommend doing everything electronically. It eliminates the possibility of something getting lost in the chain somewhere, whether it be in the mail or once it reaches the place, make sure it reaches the right desk. So it's easier to just go ahead and do it online, and usually the agencies are going to see it done online anyway, so, or not online, but they have electronic files, so it makes it easier for everybody. And as I mentioned, it's best to submit all the requests at the same time. Outside of DOTD, that can be a little different, but Levee District, Corps, and DNR, it's good to do that at the same time unless you've got a good reason why not. Because if you do submit them piecemeal, the first one's going to say, hey, you need such and such permit. Why haven't you done that? Or we're going to wait till you submit that one. So you're really not saving any time if you try to do one at a time. And I have some examples of agencies from other states we work with, because again, this focuses a little more on Louisiana permits, but it applies everywhere. So we've worked with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Texas Land Department, and it's a lot of the similar stuff. And it's always best to get in touch with everyone before and make sure you're getting the right thing. Ports are also involved in permitting or approving projects, and they can get really involved depending on where you're doing work and how involved they are, because they're almost more like partners in obtaining permits for new docks and building within their port. So they're going to want to see probably more detail and have more comments and more calculations and those things. Sealed sketches or drawings, I have the question mark after this one because I think that's the state it's in right now. And for a while, it was never really sealed. You wouldn't see drawings sealed or permit application sealed. Then people started paying more attention to the laws and rules, and it was getting sealed. And then the agency started requiring it to be sealed. But just recently, at least in Louisiana, but it's based on the national PE rules, they allowed for issuing something for permits without a seal, as long as you put on the permit drawing that's preliminary for permit purposes only. To me, that indicates that you don't have to seal it, but it doesn't say that you can't. So I take it as optional, although I have gotten one agency that received sealed drawings and requested that I resubmit them unsealed with that statement on them, although I take it more as optional than mandatory. But just in general, if you're in doubt on whether or not you need to seal something, I'd say lean in the direction of sealing and put whatever qualification statements are necessary. You are far more likely to get in trouble with the professional board for not sealing something that should be sealed than sealing something that didn't technically need to be. So err on the side of caution there is my recommendation. Excuse me. So getting to some general experiences and tips that I've had along the way. The first one's a big one, and I say it anytime permits come up, is it is really never too early to apply for a permit, provided you know what you want to do. Minor changes, they don't need to be re-permitted, as long as the location and type of installation remains similar. And even if you do need to do a modification, it's easier than just holding and starting from ground zero with that. So again, the earlier the better. Permitting, if you've been involved with projects for a while, especially since I started doing it, and post-Katrina, it's become a lot more involved. I restores the good old days where you would just go to lunch with the guy at the Corps and treat them, and you'd have your permit a little bit later, but that was a long time ago, and now it's very regulated and takes time, and so I recommend getting ahead of the game, especially with the way the river's been acting lately. It seems like every year we have longer and longer high river seasons, and that is a factor that you nor I nor anyone can control. So it's good to get ahead of the game when you're involved with these things. And then when in doubt, I recommend going ahead and submitting a permit request or application, or at least getting involved with the agencies. There's plenty of gray area in what requires a permit and what doesn't. It comes up in that, no, this is maintenance or this isn't maintenance, or somebody might think they don't need one, but it's always better to go ahead and get that and to not, and have your project shut down in the middle of it and face fines and sanctions and even criminal penalties in some circumstances. So it's much better to get it. The cost and timing up front is usually way better to go ahead and do it than not and take the risk. So prior to preparing a permit application, I look at where I'm at and who's going to be involved, and I always like to touch base with all the different agencies, and a lot of them have guides and they update them every year or two, and just say, hey, is this still current? Is this still what we need to do? And kind of give them a heads up of what's going to be coming down the pipe. And similarly, after I've prepared the application, but before I submit it, I'll touch base with those agencies again to say, hey, we're going to be submitting this permit in the next day or two and coming your way, and please keep an eye out for it. Touch base if you don't receive it, or if you have anything you see right away that we need to add, and so we can get that to you ASAP. And just keeping them in the loop, I find, helps things continue to move along. Some more thoughts. There are a lot of uncertainties in permitting. It can depend on who at the agency reviews your permit request, what the directives are from their management, and it even involves some political decisions at times higher up the chain. So there's as frustrating as it can be at times. Things can be different one way or another. In fact, we did a permit request not that long ago for an access ramp, and we had done the exact same access ramp, same location details a couple of years before that, submitted the permit, had no problems. So he said, look, we're just going to submit the exact same permit request, put the drawings, mentioned that we'd done this before, and they shouldn't get us any trouble, but They did. They wanted to see all kinds of analysis and asked all kinds of questions, and even though it was the exact same as a permit we'd done previously. So you never know what you're going to get. The same thing could be treated differently on 2 days, or even the same permit throughout if it changes hands. So it can be frustrating at times, but that leads me to our next tip. And even if you are frustrated, I always recommend remaining friendly and courteous. Being ugly or short, never going to help your case here. And I think that's true everywhere, but especially with permitting and the agencies where they really don't have to answer to you. It always helps to just stay friendly and on their good side. And even in the unlikely event that you did take a harsh tone and it did work on this one, if you ever plan on doing more permits, it's probably not going to be good for your relationship down the road, because having a good relationship with the permitting people is very helpful, especially in getting some informal or off the record advice. Sometimes I can call them up and say, hey, this is, and I have to say the client, just say, look, hey, we're looking at a project that involves X, Y, and Z. Do you think we're going to need this, or do you think we're going to need this? We're not holding you to it, but just some advice up front. And they usually will help you as best as they can if you've had a good working relationship with them. But if not, they'll just say, submit it, and we'll let you know down the road what you need. So again, always good to stay on their good side. So as before I mentioned, they'll request different things, surveys, analysis, or just general clarifications. I always like to respond in one response with everything if possible. If you just piecemeal 8 different responses, it's probably going to get lost in the shuffle among the many different agencies, and so you have to resubmit it anyway, and they're probably not going to look at it, so you get a comprehensive response either way. So I generally wait and hold it and respond at one time, unless you've got one thing that's really just going to be a standout and you want to get everything but that one, and then you can mention that. But if possible, it's best to go ahead and submit one response. The Corps has standard details for a lot of things on the levee or in the batcher. I recommend using those. It makes your life easier on multiple fronts. You don't have to reinvent the wheel for any details. And if you're using a Corps detail, they're not going to scrutinize it hard because it's their own detail. So you save yourself on 2 fronts there. So where applicable, go ahead and use them. Many agencies will offer a pre-application meeting, but the Corps, or like some of the agencies that review for the Corps Levee District, like we've met with the River Pilots, or we've met with the Corps. You don't need this on every project, but if you've got something that's questionable or really not standard, this can be very helpful, so keep that in mind. Doesn't cost anything, and they can get whoever needs to be in the room, and nothing's binding that comes out of these meetings, but they can give you some advice. Maintenance, what is maintenance can be tricky. I've heard people try to say driving piles is maintenance. I don't think that's going to fly in the eyes of the agencies. If you can see on the right here, I've got a picture of a fender being changed out. It was replacing a damaged fender with the exact same one. To me, I do think that qualifies as maintenance. But if you're expanding the footprint of your dock or adding foundations, anything along those lines, I don't think that's to be maintenance, no matter how you classify it. In Louisiana, and I've mentioned this a time or two, river level, and definitely got to factor that into your project, and not just the construction impact, but also the permitting impact, because some things that they may request can require physical access to the levee or batcher, and if the river level is too high, you're not going to be able to get to it. So that can delay your response to inquiries, which can delay your permit, which can delay your construction into possibly another high river season. So always got to be aware of the river level around here. It can play a big factor into many things. And finally, I recommend when you talk to people, save your contacts throughout the process. Write down their name, number, keep it somewhere, especially if you have a direct line. It's always easier to get in touch with someone directly and get some information from them, as opposed to calling up generic Corps number and trying to find the right place. It's much more difficult that way. And the more you communicate with someone, the better relationship you can build up, and the more they're willing to help you. So save your contacts and you can reach out to them. But I guess on the other end is don't abuse that privilege if they've helped before. So keep that in mind. On this page, I've got some resources for different permits, Levee Districts and core sites, and CPRA and DNR. They've got some really thorough guides, and if you're looking for some more information, they go into much more detail on these. So these are some good links to keep in mind. And with that, I'd like to open it up for some questions or comments. Anyone please chime in if you got anything.
All right, thanks, Justin. It looks like we have a few questions. The first one is it better for the facility to apply for the permit or for the consultant to apply for the permit?
Okay, so this one, I don't know if there's a better. I would recommend letting the consultant apply, because you're probably gonna have a consultant involved to kind of lay out your dock or your engineering, unless you have a very robust internal marine and structural engineering department. And then it's kind of more up to the facility. You know, some of them like to be the actual applicant, so they have a specific person they want to be. But if you don't have a strong opinion on it, I would recommend letting the consultant do it, because usually there's almost always going to be some back and forth, and you don't want to just be the middleman between the consultant and the permitting agencies, because it slows things down. So that way they can get directly in touch with the consultant that applies as an agent for a facility. Okay. That's my recommendation.
Next question, are geotechnical borings included or required in these kinds of permits?
So a permit for a geotechnical boring is going to be required many times within these same footprints, but they are typically handled by geotechnical engineers outside of these, because they have all the information they want very nailed down to exactly what's required, and they can usually push them through a little quicker than the overall project permits are. So it's all typically done by the geotechnical engineer.
Okay. Matt asks, for the application process, what is the average cost for the additional analysis, and does it cost to have Corps and other entities look at the application?
So I'm assuming that's for like say a stability analysis or a license survey. Those, it depends, and that's going to be a geotech that does that, or at least a stability or bearing. But I would say they're about $10,000 usually is what they're going to run you if they can use borings that they already have, either through Freedom of Information Act request or other projects. Survey might be a little less, but that's the general ballpark of those requests there.
Okay.
Did I address all the question?
No. There's a couple more. Can anything be done on a company side to expedite the application process from 6 months to 2 months, for example?
You can get some of the analyses up front if you think you're going to need them. That will save some back and forth. Pre-application meeting might be able to expedite it some, but in my experience, there's really not too much you can do. I've had people that say, hey, I know somebody, I'm going to give them a call, and it usually doesn't really change things much. So the process is, it is what it is, and usually there's not much you can do to shortcut it.
And Justin, are NDAs needed for the application process?
For the consultant, I guess you could have them sign an NDA, but I don't think you can make the agencies commit to a non-disclosure. In fact, sometimes they have to disclose as part of the posting public notice, or if you do receive a letter of no objection, those are usually posted as well. So well, I've never done it. You may be able to get something that says prior to it being approved, so if it's approved, at that point it's public, but maybe before you could get something, but I've never had that personally. But if you're working with a consultant, obviously you can work out an NDA with them, but as far as government agencies, I don't know that you can do anything on that front, and definitely not on the back end.
Okay. Clint asks, what experiences or challenges have you had with the Port of Houston in regards to permitting?
We've done some in Houston. We've worked with the Texas General Land Office, as I said before, and they were reasonable to work with. The ports are going to want to be more involved, almost like a partner than agency reviewing. So they're going to want to know, excuse me, more on what your capabilities are of loading and the structural capabilities and all of those kinds of things. Whereas like the Corps is just going to know the layout and that you've done the proper calculations. They don't care if you're bringing in Suezmax, Panamax, or Aframax. Whereas the port, they're almost more like a partner, and that they want to know a lot more information about the project itself and the design and the capabilities and their involvement on that end, and in my experience. And that's Port of Houston and Port of Corpus we've worked with in those ports in Texas.
Okay, and sort of along that same lines, do you have experience with marine work in other states? We talked a lot about Louisiana, but.
Yeah, that's we kind of had to focus on Louisiana, because if I just did the whole thing in abstract, it would be kind of hard to focus. But we've done work all over the Gulf Coast, up along the East Coast, up in Massachusetts and Georgia, down to Florida, again, Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and then on the West Coast as well. And we've even done some international work, Caribbean and Europe is on top of that. So we've done work all over, inland too. We've done work inland on Mississippi River, West Virginia, Tennessee. And again, it's the principles apply pretty much everywhere. You need to show your work, what's being done. You want to be clear. You don't want to include more than you need to, but you need to include what's needed. So everything that we went over will apply to most places, but we just focus on Louisiana today because we had to do one.
Okay. And so far, I think this might be the last question. Can you submit multiple permit applications for the same project?
So I guess that's referring to like piecemealing a permit application. And it's kind of I'll give a lawyer answer on this one. Yes and no. The agencies aren't going to be concerned about your own project definition. So if you've got one project which involves a lot of process stuff well inside your plant, and a dock, something running out there, if it looks like two projects, then you could probably do two applications if you need to for some reason. But on the other end, if you're doing things that are in the same area and around the same timing, it looks like you're just submitting one piece and then another piece of it, and they look at it as a whole, they're going to stop and say, hey, you need to submit this all as one application as opposed to all these different ones. So it really depends on what it looks like to I guess a neutral party. If they picked it up and looked at it, kind of do a sanity check. Is this all should be submitted as one, or is it far enough and separate enough from a big picture that it could be different projects, even if internally it all applies to one project? So that's the way I look at that. But submit everything at the same time if possible. But if you have some things are going to take longer, like if you're doing a rack over River Road and out to a new dock or an existing dock, that's going to be more involved than if you've got some pump foundations in that same project, 1,400 feet land side of the levee. You're going to want to get that dock project going as fast as possible, but if you're not ready for the land side, you can hold on that.
Okay. Justin, I don't see any other questions. So I think we can probably wrap this up unless you had anything else you wanted to cover today.
No, again, thanks everybody tuned in. I appreciate your time. Contact information's here. You can always reach out if I can help in any way. And I believe Renee will be making this available on our YouTube site if anybody wants to share it with other people.
Yep, exactly. All right. Thanks, Justin. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll see you again next time.
All right, thank you all.